Hello and welcome everyone. My name is Raymond Karam. I'm the Senior Director for Programs and Outreach at the Arab Gulf States Institute in Washington, and we are the organizers of this forum. It's our wonderful pleasure to be here for the third year running and the first time on the NYU campus. Delighted to be in this room and this beautiful surroundings, and thank you all for joining us. We have a great program for you today. It's especially a hot and important topic. We do have a few changes from the schedule that you picked up on your way in. Unfortunately, there was a change in the keynote speakers because of the late announcement for the GCC summit. So both our keynote speakers, His Excellency Dr. Abdulaziz Al-Awashik is organizing, of course, the summit in Riyadh, and His Excellency Dr. Anwar Gargash will have to be there, and both will not be able to join us today. But we do still have a wonderful lineup, and all of our keynotes or of our panelists are here with us today. But to get us started first, I want to give the floor to our president, Ambassador Marcel Wahba, who will give a few introductory remarks, and then after that we'll move to the first session, which will be moderated by Mina Al-Oraibi from the National. Thank you.
Well, good morning. I'm delighted to be here. Being back in Abu Dhabi is definitely like being back home. And seeing so many familiar faces and friends, thank you for being with us this morning. It's a very special event for us. It's our third UAE Annual Security Forum, as Raymond mentioned. And really the purpose of this event is to bring together US, UAE, and regional partners to discuss, assess, and identify solutions to some of the region's most pressing and critical challenges. In that respect, the UAE Security Forum is a key element of our core mission at the Arab Gulf States Institute. Our mission is to build bridges of understanding between the United States and the Gulf Arab states. That's not something we can do if we're only hosting discussions in Washington, and hence our decision 3 years ago to begin coming to the region to conduct events such as this one, which allow us to hear directly from you, the men and women who live and work in the region, and whose perspective is so important for us to understand this dynamic part of the world. Much has been said and written about the war in Yemen, the complexity of the conflict, the many parties involved in it, both foreign and domestic, and the fact that it has created the worst humanitarian crisis in the world. As is so often the case with armed conflict, the civilian population caught in the middle endures the greatest suffering, and there can be no doubt that the people of Yemen are facing a grim future indeed. Their country's economy, infrastructure, and institutions are either destroyed or irreparably damaged. Clearly, the only way the war will end is through a political process, and so we, like so many of you, have been watching intently for some news from Stockholm that will offer a glimmer of hope that the end of conflict may be within sight. And yet, we know too that we cannot wait for the war to end neatly and clearly in order to begin the essential planning for the physical reconstruction and the political reconciliation, without which Yemen will never heal. And so we gather today not to talk about how to bring the war to an end. We will leave that difficult task to UN envoy Martin Griffiths and the parties to the conflict. No, our purpose today is to focus on Yemen after the war. We do so with a healthy dose of humility, for the stabilization and reconstruction of Yemen will be a daunting task indeed. The effort will require sustained political and economic support from nations here in the region and from the international community writ large. Most important, the world must be prepared to move quickly into Yemen to assure its men, women, and especially its children that their long nightmare is over, that they have not been forgotten, that the world understands that our futures are inextricably linked. A stable and secure Yemen is our goal, but we would be kidding ourselves if we fail to acknowledge just how difficult it will be to get from here to there. In this regard, it will be critical for all the regional and international stakeholders to work in tandem to ensure that the resources that are mobilized in support of stabilization and reconstruction are deployed effectively and equitably all across Yemen, and that institutional framework needed for this outcome is put in place, and that its legitimacy is unquestioned. So today, throughout the forum, we encourage participation from all of you as our speakers and panelists tackle the issues we have identified as central to Yemen's future stability. How to build a lasting peace that goes beyond bricks and mortar and recognizes the need to repair the social and political fabric of Yemen. How to minimize the risk that external powers will view Yemen's recovery through the prism of their own security and economic interests. How to assist in developing Yemen's many important economic assets, from its energy resources to its deep water ports to untapped tourism potential. This is an ambitious agenda for a one-day forum, but I believe that we have sufficient expertise and insight assembled in this room to examine the issues before us and come up with actionable recommendations that will help inform the decisions policymakers will be called upon to make in coming weeks and months. Before we begin, I would like to take a moment to recognize and thank our partners who've helped us make today's event possible. Lockheed Martin, AmCham Abu Dhabi, the National Etihad Airways, and of course, NYU Abu Dhabi. Thank you all for being here, for participating in this important event, and I very much look forward to the discussions throughout the day. Thank you.
So moving on to the first session, if we can call up our speakers, Ambassador Steve Seche, Mr. Tim Lenderking, Mr. Mohammed Abulahoum, and we have our wonderful moderator with us, Mina Al-Oraibi, Editor-in-Chief of the national newspaper. Thank you.
Good morning. Thank you so much for joining us this morning. We have a very strong panel to kick off our discussions about how do we get to the peace, but also how do we win the peace, and that's the essential part. We're delighted that Mr. Abulahoum is here straight from Sweden, so we hope to get the latest updates from there. We have Mr. Lenderking, who is Deputy Assistant Secretary for Arabian Gulf Affairs at the State Department, and he will speak to us about where the view from Washington is. Of course, Mr. Mohammed Abulahoum, those who follow Yemen don't need an introduction for him, but I probably should introduce him formally, Chairman of the Justice and Building Party of Yemen, and Ambassador Stephen Seche, who is Senior VP at the Arab Gulf States Institute in Washington, but also, of course, formerly U.S. Ambassador to Yemen and somebody who has followed Yemen very closely for many years. I would like to start with Mr. Lenderking giving us a brief overview from Washington. So we'll start with you before we begin the discussion.
Thank you very much. Good morning, and I'd like to thank Ambassador Wabe and Ambassador Seche and their outstanding teams at AGSIW for planning and hosting today's event, which I don't think could be any more timely than it is. I'd like to spend a few minutes just giving you our perspective on the way forward for Yemen, which will rely on three components: meeting Yemen's immediate humanitarian needs while supporting a negotiated cessation of hostilities and a comprehensive peace agreement, developing a sustained and coordinated approach to early recovery and reconstruction, and ultimately rebuilding the social fabric and national identity of Yemeni society. First, the urgent humanitarian and political component. Our collective continued assistance is critical to preventing famine-like conditions. The United States is among the top humanitarian donors to Yemen. We provided more than $697 million in fiscal year 2018, which includes nearly $131 million in additional emergency food assistance that Secretary Pompeo announced on November 27th. The U.S. Agency for International Development, the Department of State continue to play a pivotal role in service provision and governance capacity building. We invest in Yemen's education system by feeding more than 900,000 Yemeni children daily and putting over 2 million children back in school. We support the recovery of Yemen's health system and repair infrastructure to provide potable water and reduce the likelihood of further devastating cholera outbreaks. Our efforts also include promoting social protection programs to create job opportunities and providing technical assistance to the economic institutions to strengthen the Yemeni economy. In addition to our direct support, we continue to urge all parties to allow the access to and transit of humanitarian and commercial goods without impediment. We've also called on all parties to help facilitate the visas and travel of humanitarian actors and avoid actions that interfere with humanitarian efforts. The continued provision of humanitarian and commercial goods is of paramount importance to the United States. In conjunction with Yemen's urgent humanitarian situation, we are supporting a sustained political solution. The Houthis and the Yemeni government are in Sweden as we speak, as noted. This is a positive step. We are encouraging them to engage fully and genuinely in consultations. UN Special Envoy for Yemen, Martin Griffiths, has already made progress on an agreement to exchange prisoners, and working groups have formed to discuss other confidence-building measures, including strengthening Yemen's economy. He's also introduced a framework for a broader peace settlement that will require buy-in from the parties. We'll continue to support the United Nations-led efforts toward a negotiated cessation of hostilities and a comprehensive peace agreement in Yemen. We do that by working the range of political and humanitarian issues bilaterally with the coalition leadership and with the Yemen government, and in 3- and 4-party groupings with Saudi Arabia, United Arab Emirates, and the UK at both the experts and ministerial level. We've met in multiple capitals throughout this conflict and have found these Troika and Quad groupings useful for coordinating our efforts in Yemen and providing essential international support for the UN. We have no illusions that this process will be easy, but we welcome the Sweden talks as a necessary and vital first step. We continue to support the internationally recognized government of Yemen. As we look down the road, we seek a stable and unified Yemen that fosters rather than drains regional and global stability, supports efforts to address the dire humanitarian consequences of the conflict in Yemen, ensures the safety and prosperity of all Yemeni people, and one that can withstand the destabilizing influence of Iran. That brings me to my second component of our support for Yemen's future, a sustained and coordinated transition to early recovery and reconstruction. The international community needs to support the Yemen government's ability to provide essential services and ensure good governance practices that enhance Yemenis' capacity to manage conflicts at the local level. Looking ahead, once a peace agreement is reached, experts project there could be over 1 million former combatants in Yemen. To prepare for this, we are examining post-conflict security sector reform and disarmament, demobilization, and reintegration needs. This will be a priority for our medium-term support. We've also invested in demining programs around the country. Our early recovery efforts are already underway, but full-scale reconstruction can only occur in a peaceful environment. For that reason, we want to close the space for malign Iranian influence. As the war winds down, we will encourage all sides to focus on reconstruction and peace building in Yemen without Tehran's interference. There's no place in a future Yemen for an Iranian-backed threat to Saudi Arabia, the UAE, and vital international economic corridors. Furthermore, we will need to focus on counterterrorism and malign non-state actors. Our security cooperation with the Yemen government and the Saudi-led coalition supports programs that develop the capacity of Yemen's security forces, counters violent extremism, and builds the capacity of law enforcement for a future unified Yemen. Coalition efforts to fight terrorist networks in eastern and southern Yemen have produced measurable gains. Moving forward, we will need to work together to ensure that a future Yemen is no safe haven for al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula or the Islamic State in Yemen. We're grateful for the cooperation of all of our partners in this vital area. Yemen needs the continued support and generosity of its Gulf neighbors and donors from around the world to assist in its reconstruction and the rehabilitation of former fighters. So once the fighting is ended and reconstruction is underway, what does a unified and prosperous Yemen look like? That's the third component of our way forward in Yemen, a rejuvenation of Yemen's social fabric. A future Yemen would see empowered actors who can resolve local conflicts through nonviolent means. Yemenis and international donors would support functioning institutions that provide for their needs and reduce reliance on strongmen and corrupt patronage networks. We need to work together to ensure Yemenis see a convincing future in these institutions in their economy rather than in militias, terrorist groups, and outside provocateurs. This is a tall order, and we're a long way from getting there, but one way to support this goal is by ensuring peace efforts lead to a representative government. As institutions rebuild their capacity, the international community must prepare itself for a strong and sustained presence in a unified Yemen, despite future threats and challenges posed by the efforts of rebuilding and unification. A unified and prosperous Yemen at peace with itself and its neighbors is critical to stability in the Gulf region and safe navigation in the vital waterways of the Red Sea and the Bab el-Mandeb. Yemenis deserve the opportunity to achieve a bright future. It is time to end this conflict, replace conflict with compromise, and allow the Yemeni people to heal through peace and revitalization.
Thank you very much. Mr. Abulahoum, please, we'd like to hear your remarks about how we can win the peace.
Thank you so much. Thank you to Marcella for the invitation, and thanks to Steve. And I do extend my appreciation to New York University. I will go directly onto the points so that we can, I will just take about 3-4 minutes so we can have more time in Q&A. I think we'd like to hear from you as much as you want to hear from us. And what Tim said is quite interesting, and this has been the U.S. position all along, and I think they have done a good job all the way from 2011 until today, and we hope that this partnership will continue. And of course, our partners or our brothers here in the Gulf, especially Saudi and UAE, have done a tremendous job. So what are the challenges that I think, and many of you think, and probably these are some, and I'm sure you have even better ones that can help us all move forward. I think the important challenges that we have right now that we think is what we need is to learn from the experience that we've had at 2011 until today. While everybody was busy, and I do admit we were busy in the national dialogue in talking about quotas and talking about constitution, and we never focused on the problem that the people had. If you look at the citizens, they did not feel any improvement in their lives. Basic services was deteriorated, security got worse, and no jobs were created. Even the money that donors committed to Yemen for about 8 billion was not absorbed, and it was not allocated to serious projects. They only focused on huge projects that were not being able to be implemented. So what do we need to do right now? We really have to zoom in and see what we need. We need projects that can have an impact on the average citizen. That's if we want to move forward, especially after, the next stage of rebuilding Yemen. because we cannot just focus on mega projects and not focus on the projects that really will affect the people throughout the country. So this is one what we think is important. The other point is we need to carefully address the lack of government capacity in post-conflict period. Yemen was already suffering from lack of capacity before the war, let alone after 4 years of war, which has effectively collapsed most of the institutions that we have. And in order to avoid a conflict factors that will continue to exist and will return every 2 to 5 years, what we should do is take this opportunity to redesign many of the institutions to deliver the objective we are looking for in post-conflict. So we don't want to keep on getting in the same mistakes that we've had in the past. I think one of the other points is that the recovery period, or what you would call a transitional period. What do we need to focus at? I think there are 3 or 4 points that I think that are essential. The first one is reconstituting legitimacy. Here, the focus should not be a rush to elections, as we have seen again and again, how rushing into elections too early in post-conflict period throws society back into conflicts. Sometimes we tend to exaggerate about elections, and we think that democracy has to be done immediately, and there are not serious foundations for that. And this is one of the lessons that we did in Yemen. I mean, whenever we were talking about a transitional period, we always used to say 1 year is enough, and then 3 years passes, 4 years passes, and then we go back to the same cycle. I hope that we can overcome these challenges and focus on participation and inclusiveness and accountability, unlike how things were done in the past. Regional and international powers have to help Yemen in addressing key factors, mainly sharing of power and wealth. This is the key to any issue in Yemen. It's power and wealth, and I think in many other countries as well. The second point is re-establishing security. Here, the focus should be on DDR, or disarmament, demobilization, and reintegration. This is very crucial for Yemen. We have a huge number of armed forces, plus militia forces, that we have to deal with, and to see how we can reintegrate them into society, what should be done. And I think this is a serious issue, and we hope that the international community, and especially our neighbors, will help us in doing that. The third point is rebuilding trust and hope. Here, the focus should be on delivering primary services that are important to people, judiciary, security, and utilize efforts by private sector and civil society. We have to use the private sector and the civil society, especially in these days, when you do not have a state right now to run everything. Yemenis want to live. They've had enough suffering, and I think it's about time that Yemenis would like to move forward. The fourth point is mending the social fabric. Here, the focus should be on a transitional justice process, addressing grievances based on serious reconciliation and forgiveness programs. This is what Yemen needs. By the way, Yemenis are the masters of reconciliation and forgiveness. How do we move forward? This is what we would like the international and our neighbors to help us. That's why I am optimistic. If you ask me, where do I get this being so optimistic? I know Yemenis are, and many of you know Yemenis. Once the war stops, reconciliation will pick up. And I think we've seen this. There is a hope, a glimpse of hope that we see in Sweden. Finally, all these points and others cannot be implemented if we do not restructure the legitimate government. That will include all groups, the Houthis, GPC, southern groups, including the STC, legitimate government, and independent. The government will contribute to stability and enhance confidence building among conflicting groups and build trust with its neighbors to move Yemen forward. After all, Saudi Arabia and UAE are important to us. Our shared history goes a long way back, and our future is with them and not with Iran. And I don't want to go into the idea of Iran too much, because I think we'll hear later on. But one of the biggest questions that we keep getting about Yemen and Iran, Yemen can never be an ally of Iran, and vice versa. Yemen is part of this region, and I hope that we can move forward. But this is the responsibility of both Yemenis and our Saudi and UAE partners to make sure that the experience we've had the last 4 or 5 years will never happen again. How do you bring in Yemen to be a serious partner in stability, and vice versa? Yemen would like to be a country that can be an area of investment, and the idea of a GCC. Personally, if you ask me, I think it's too early for the GCC to be members of GCC Council. But we can have an economic partnership that will be a viable partnership that will strengthen the relationship and will give confidence to the Gulf and to Yemenis, because always we've been discussing about the GCC for the last 15, 20 years. And you're qualified, you're not qualified. So let's cut all this road and go directly. We need a serious economic partnership that can move Yemen until you qualify Yemen or Yemen is qualified in the next 5 or 10 years, and then we can talk about other options. I don't want to go into much in length. I would like to stop in here and give more time to more discussion on the question and answer. Thank you very much.
Ambassador Seche, if we can hear your remarks, please.
Thank you, Mina, and thanks to Tim for coming all the way from Washington, and of course, thank you, Mohammed, for coming down from Sweden overnight to make it here. We're very grateful to have everyone here, and you all too, for that matter, and we do want to hear from you. This is a room full of people with a lot of expertise and a lot of ideas, and we really do need to build starting now. And if I can move from what Tim and Mohammed both said and encourage us to kind of think of how do we implement these very good, solid ideas both of them have expressed to us. And my idea that I want to put out in front of you is today is the day we begin to think about what is a Reconstruction Authority really going to look like as a practical matter. What's the infrastructure? What's the architecture of that? Who's participating in it? Who has influence? How do we ensure transparency? How do we ensure donations are well stewarded and can be moved effectively into Yemen? I think Tim has mentioned the Quad, which is the US, UK, Saudi Arabia, and the UAE. If I could add, if I have the liberty of adding, the UN and the World Bank as INGOs with influence and opportunity and expertise, if we could get these groups assembled, nations and INGOs, to begin to think, what is this authority going to be? Who's going to be on the board of directors? And I would say we need to make sure the major donor countries are on the board, along with whatever national government emerges in Yemen, to ensure the buy-in from the cabinet and the relevant authorities in Yemen, and very much ensure that this overarching Reconstruction Authority has direct ties to local authorities, so that what ensues post-conflict is a bottom-up and not top-down reconstruction process, because nothing would be less effective than if Yemenis see the international community coming in and dictating what needs to be done to rebuild their lives. And in this sense, Mohammed made a very important point. We need to think small. We need to think about things like water, sanitation, electricity. How do we rebuild markets? How do we have communities begin to rebuild themselves so that people in Yemen begin to feel that their lives are really genuinely going to change for the better, because the international community has put the resources at their disposal. If we don't do this, we are bound to fail. And Yemen has had too many experiences with reconstruction in the past, be it related to disasters or earlier rounds of conflict, where it was not properly implemented and it did not succeed the way we'd like to see it. And one final point, because I don't want to go on very long at all, but we need to also imagine so much of this happening before real peace comes to Yemen. We can talk about peace in Yemen and not having a peaceful Yemen. There'll be a large war that maybe can be resolved or at least put in abeyance. There'll be a lot of small conflicts that will continue. This cannot be something that's going to put us off or help us say we can't get into Yemen to begin this, yet we need to start thinking of ways to put resources on the ground. There are Yemenis in the country who have stayed, who are still quite willing to work and are working today. One of the great strengths of Yemen is its civil society. The women and the men who are still in Yemen, who understand their communities, who have the faith and the trust of their neighbors, can begin to be the authorities that can help implement whatever we in this room and our governments think is in their interest. Thank you very much.
Thank you. So we have about an hour to go. We'll have a brief discussion here on the panel, and then we're going to open it to Q&A from the floor. So please have your questions ready and then indicate when you'd like to ask a question. But I will take the liberty of being chair to pose a couple of questions to you before we open it up to the floor. And the first is, you're right in terms of we have to think about the rebuilding from now, and we have to give people the hope that there could be peace and there is a way of reconciliation before you get the final peace details. So Mr. Abulahoum, if I can please start with you. What can the international community do to provide either guarantees or to provide that impetus to start the confidence building measures?
I think the international community has a lot of responsibility right now, or a moral responsibility towards Yemen. If you look at the conflict in Yemen 3-4 years ago, probably a lot of people will say Yemenis can't solve that problem at that time. Today, I think it has taken a different direction where there is regional and international. So we do need support, and I still believe that Yemen is not Syria or Iraq. We do not have sectarian war. We do not have a civil war. Thank God, until now. If you look, Yemenis have a conflict that takes place from 8 in the morning until 5 or 8 until 4. Yemenis want to live. I mean, if you look at areas in Sana'a, in Adan, or in Ta'az, there is not strong coordination between the international community, even though the P5 position has been very positive. They have been all along positive and supportive of Yemen more than any other countries. But we would like them to pressure the negotiating group, especially the ones that are in Sweden right now, and to seriously pressure them, reward whoever is moving forward, and take serious measures against whoever the spoiler is. They have to hear that. And by doing this, I think we can move forward. And this is one of the things that we hope to hear and see from them.
You've just come from Sweden, and there are many hopes pinned onto the process now that it's actually starting. So what can you tell us about the momentum that's being built, the political momentum that can be seized upon, and how do you stop the spoilers?
I think the best thing that has happened in Sweden is that both groups are in Sweden. That's a step. And just sitting, I mean, if you look, I was there, I mean, if you see them the first day they would not even look at each other. The next day, I mean, we used to share the same restaurant. Each side will be in one side and the other side. The next day, this guy will move into the other table, and people started talking. The third day, they're shaking hands, and things are moving. And the atmosphere itself, they understand that Yemenis are sick and tired of the war. And personally, if you ask me, the weakest groups in all this are the ones that are fighting. They have nothing to deliver. If you look at the legitimate government, sadly, they haven't delivered much in the last 3-4 years. They have done a poor job. And if you look at the other side of the Houthis, they haven't done a good job either. They have not delivered anything. So you have the balance of the weak. And this is the opportunity where we can move forward. And I hope we take this advantage. The strongest group in all this is the ordinary Yemeni that is suffering and that is having all the pain. And I think Ms. Grandi will give us a good picture. She's doing a good job, and we do appreciate what she's doing with the other UN organization and other NGOs. So this is what is happening right now. And again, am I optimistic? Yes, I am optimistic. Has there been opening of subjects that might be resolved or 50% resolved? And the most important thing is, if we can get things done right now, and then the next round we'll do some things more, as long as you keep that momentum going. Yes, I think especially if you look at the prisoner release, I'll just touch on some of the points that I can't talk about. Prisoners release, probably we will hear some good news within the next 5 to 6 days. The economy is, the committee on the economy, they are doing a good job. They're meeting and they're sitting with each other, and things are moving. We might have some breakthrough, probably on Ta'az, maybe on the airport, something might come up down the road. And of course, Al-Hudaydah is an issue that is the big issue that will be discussed. But from what I heard from the beginning, or 2 weeks ago and 3 days ago and yesterday, there is some hope that something might come up. Maybe not all the way, but something might come down the road, hopefully.
Mr. Lenderking, if I can turn to you, of course, for those of us who have been following Yemen, not just since the start of the war, but many years preceding that, we did have moments where you felt that this is the moment for Yemen, there's international consensus. The transition of power in 2011 and 12 was seen as actually this is an example of how things could go well. And of course, then we saw how things progressed after that. And of course, we had the national dialogue, which again gave us some concrete ideas, but unfortunately didn't come to fruition. From both Washington's standpoint, but also internationally speaking, how do you stop the spoilers? Because yes, the Yemeni people are tired of war, but there are still people on the ground with guns. The war is a result of a coup that happened in Sana'a. So how do you change that dynamic, and how do you stop the spoilers?
I think the first element is to provide incentives for parties to see some hope in a political process. I think to this point, as you say, we've had fledgling efforts. Everybody gathered around the table in Kuwait in 2016. 8 or 10 weeks of intensive negotiation broke down. I think we're in a slightly better place right now for a number of reasons. The energy of the special envoy. I think the increasing exhaustion of inside Yemen for this conflict going on. Obviously, there are pressures in our own system, as you can see in the United States, to either withdraw from the conflict or discontinue our support to the coalition, which we are strongly opposed to on the administration side. We do believe that the support for the coalition is necessary, sends a wrong message if we discontinue that support. And I think if you look at inside Yemen, the dedication of the humanitarian groups, weathering this violence, willing to take a huge amount of risk to stay in the game is really important. What I see from our side also is very important coordinating mechanisms that are happening. I know that I mentioned the Quad as a vital way of coordinating between at least the United States, UK, Saudi Arabia, and the UAE. And I'm not saying it's been perfect, but it gets us in the same room together, focusing on the priorities, working to disentangle potentially conflicting objectives in certain areas, and paramount the strong message, I think, to Iran to stay out. This is not your fight. Iranian involvement is a pernicious element here. It is not a role for the Iranians to play in this particular conflict in the Arabian Peninsula. And then I think within Yemen itself, the key thing is that Yemeni elements who might act as spoilers themselves, again, need to see that a political process has real potential. And so I think, trying to capitalize on this moment in Sweden is absolutely essential. Let us not overestimate, the chances of breakthroughs, but we've seen, I think, as my friend Mohammed has said, good progress. Need to support it, build on it, and I think through this, through concrete realities, we'll begin to see people invest more in a political process and see that maybe it does have some potential. I think that mitigates the chances of spoilers.
There are some concerns both here in the UAE and Saudi Arabia and amongst the internationally recognized government that for the Houthis today in the seat of power in Sana'a, that's the strongest they've ever been in Yemen and potentially the strongest they'll ever be if there is a transition government. So how do you incentivize them to actually give up what they currently have in Sana'a, but also how do you actually tell Iran, no, you stay out when they've taken advantage of every opportunity that's been given to them in Sana'a?
I think a certain amount of pressure on the Houthis has been beneficial. I think that's been on the battlefield to some extent. I think if you look at the overall trajectory, again, I think if you look at the areas where the Houthis have, which they control, we do not see, public enthusiasm for their leadership. I think, as Mohammed said, There's little to show on the ledger from the Houthi side in terms of providing services or benefits. So I don't think there's, from what we see, a great deal of popular support for the Houthis. That said, I mean, we've always advocated that the Houthis have a role in Yemen, and we're not against that. It's going to be a tall order, I think, to get the Houthis to demobilize, to disarm, to disengage from Sana'a. They're going to have to be powerful incentives for them to do that. And I think the Houthis themselves are a divided organization, and you can, I think, appeal to the more moderate elements within the Houthis to see this as a future. And again, from the United States point of view, there's no question in our mind that we're not trying to destroy the Houthis or see them pushed out of Yemen. We see them as a vital part of Yemen society. We do envision their participation in a future government, but these are things that I think will have to be worked out internally among the Yemenis. And I also think that the more that Iran's malign influence inside Yemen is exposed, the use of weapons technology that menaces Saudi Arabia, this country, vital waterways, the attacks on shipping, I think the more that that's brought to light, it's important to remember that, for our audiences back in the United States, where there's a perception that everything that explodes in Yemen is a result of the Saudi coalition. The Houthis have also disrespected civilian life. They are responsible for civilian casualties. And we are working with the Saudis, obviously, to improve their targeting practices so there's less of a negative impact on the civilians. So I think if you put everything together, there are ways that we can put the right amount of pressure and incentive on the Houthis, on the Iranians. Some positive messages, by the way, from the Iranian leadership in the last few days in support of what's happening in Sweden. We'd very much welcome more of that.
Thank you. Ambassador Seche, if I can turn to you. I mean, we heard in the opening remarks from yourself and from our two other panelists very concrete examples of how you can deliver peace to people and give them buy-in to a process that can end the war. But we've seen this in other conflicts. And as you said, you can have small ideas that impact people's lives, but it comes under a bigger umbrella of a political process. How do you mesh the two together? How do you make what's happening in Sweden, what happens at the UN Security Council, relevant for the people on the ground who are suffering at a great expense, humanitarian expense? So how do you connect the big political dynamics to small, tangible results for people on the ground?
Well, I think the key is going to be to make sure that these processes, and whether they be in Sweden or within the rooms where the Quad meets, actually pay dividends and concrete benefits. And I think one thing I meant to mention earlier and didn't is the role I think that the private sector in Yemen can and should play, and regionally as well. I think as you talk about spoilers and how we can help disincentivize their efforts, you need to be able to resuscitate the economy. And the best way to do that is jobs. And the best way to do jobs and translate jobs into practical improvements on the ground is to put people to work to do the small changes in communities that need to be done. So if you can begin to get people, as you start to talk about DDR, which is the demobilization and disarmament, some of these people can say, we'll put you to work. You can go to work back in your communities. You can be seen as a constructive force. You don't have to go back to pick up a gun to earn a salary. There is a job for you in public works back where you live, helping your community. So I think these are, what I'm urging us all to think about is how do these processes at the 30,000-foot level translate down to actual improvements on the ground when people's lives are at stake. And we need to do this with a sense of urgency. If the Yemeni people don't see their lives materially changing after the war ends, they're going to say, see, it all came to nothing. They promised us a better life. We've got nothing. We'll go back and talk to the other guys who want to give us a weapon, and we'll pick that up again. And we go back to square one. So we need to really begin to link, as you say. I mean, and this is not easy to do because the wheels of government turn very slowly, and yet the wheels on the ground are going to go very quickly and insist to be oiled with something. And that's going to be money. It's going to be resources. It's going to be mobilization of the international political will to put that all together on the ground.
So livelihoods.
Livelihoods, absolutely.
And you say, Mr. Abulahoum, I want to come to you, but I just want to follow up on that. I mean, again, when you talk about reconstruction money, often people say, well, where will that come from? The UAE and Saudi Arabia have committed so far the highest amount of figures, but again, you've had from the US and others contributions to try to help with immediate humanitarian assistance where possible. Where do you see those reconstruction funds coming from? Because you mentioned the private sector. Is there a private sector that can, from within Yemen, or does it have to come from outside?
Well, it certainly is a very strong private sector within Yemen that I think can mobilize. I also think there's a model, maybe it's not a model as yet, but maybe it should be, where you have external donors who can funnel money through their construction companies, to their entities, their private entities, into projects in reconstruction in other countries. Now, I mean, I don't want this to be a corrupt, where it's cronyism, but at the same time, if you are qualified through a bidding process to undertake a reconstruction project, then that money that my government wants to give to Yemen can go through a company from my own country, benefiting my country, benefiting the country on the receiving end of the assistance.
Just one point that Tim and Steve touched on, it's the Houthis. How can we get them to go into the process? One of the biggest challenges that we have is that these guys are a fighting machine. They survive in fighting. Others survive in peace and stability. So what was not achieved in war will be achieved in peace. Get them engaged in peace and expose them to Yemenis that these guys are not serious about peace, whether it's them or somebody else. Both sides have to be, or in fact, all sides have to be put to the test. Yemenis will determine who is not really willing to go on the peaceful process. Personally, I think the Houthis will have difficulty in peace. And again, I think this is the advantage where we have from Saudi Arabia and UAE. There is no comparison. We cannot compare between Saudi Arabia and UAE and Iran. We have nothing in common with Iran, except probably friendship down the road if things go back to normal. But our history, our future is with UAE and Saudi Arabia, and this is where we hope that they will move in, because the challenge is after the war. How do you end that radicalization or that ideology of the Houthis? Right now, it is not a worrying, but if things continue to be this way, ideology will sink in, and Yemenis will get into the mood of the Houthi or the Iranian. But right now, I can assure you that Yemenis, once there is peace and stability, you will see a serious shift from the Iranian. What are the Iranians going to provide Yemen? They will not provide anything to Yemen. And we have seen, I think they provided some water or a stack of water. I don't know what they have done, but we have not seen any human or any support for Yemen. So I think it is a big challenge right now for our neighbors, for the international community to help Yemen, and not just to continue with donations, but rather help build a state. We need a state that can absorb everything.
Thank you very much. I'd like to open the floor to questions. So if you can please indicate if you have a question, and if you could kindly introduce yourself when the question comes to you. Okay, so we have a lady over there, and then we'll come to the middle row here. So if we could, the mic, I'm afraid. Okay, the system is going to be you need to get up to the mic, so I apologize. Yes, please, yeah.
Thank you so much for this information. I would like to introduce myself briefly. My name is Najat Al-Saeed. I'm assistant professor at Zayed University in the College of Communication and Media Sciences. Well, my question to you is regarding focusing specifically in the media. In the media, even the Western media is focusing only on the casualties of those civilians who are dying. And they're not focusing that how militias work. Militias basically use those civilians as human shields. And nothing like this are showed in the media. And the other thing, we're not against the vital role of the Houthis. The Houthis are part of the Yemeni construction, we know that. But what we are against, the militia idea. Now we are in this region divided between two sections. Not Shia and Sunna as the Western media is trying to portray, but it is statehood countries or pre-statehood countries against non-statehood country. And that's our main conflict with Iran. Iran doesn't believe in governments. They're always dealing with militias. So how we can accept, or how can the whole international community, not only Saudi Arabia and UAE and the coalition, accept that? How can the international community accept a country that is supporting militias? That means that all the status are going to collapse eventually if we allow something like this. Thank you.
Thank you. Is your question targeted to somebody specific or open to the panel?
It's open for everybody who wants to answer.
All right. Okay. So we'll just take one more and then we'll turn to you. Just one more.
All right. My question is for Assistant Secretary Lenderking. I'm very grateful for your comments here. And I've watched the administration's policy towards Yemen and also towards Iran coalesce in a very interesting way. Becoming much more clear-cut, much more coherent. But I think embedded in your presentation are competing impulses that will be hard to harmonize regarding Yemen and Iran. On the one hand, there is this most welcome policy of isolating Iran and trying to pressure it through financial means and through other means to change its policies, which I think is great. On the other hand, there is this growing consensus that appears to be emerging in the administration. It's been recently strongly voiced by Secretary Mattis and others that it's time for the war in Yemen to end. It seems to me there are competing, not necessarily contradictory, but competing impulses here. So on the one hand, there might be one policy goal might suggest the need to confront Iran in Yemen and see Yemen as a crucial kind of field within that regional confrontation. On the other hand, if you really want to end the war in Yemen as soon as possible, you probably have to engage Iran, and certainly Iranian proxies and Iranian clients and allies in order to do that. So I think you see what I mean when I talk about competing impulses that will be hard to harmonize, and I wish you could address that. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Hussein. Let me start with the last first and then work back to the other question. I guess one of the things that's helped the administration see the urgency of ending the conflict in Yemen is the continued Iranian interference and the fact that there are, regular missile attacks from Yemen into Saudi Arabia, into the UAE. Fortunately, no mass casualties up to this point, but clearly there is an effort, I think, by the Houthis, provoked and encouraged by Iran to do that, to hit airports, to hit palaces, to hit oil infrastructure. God forbid we encounter a situation like that. So it does point to the urgency, I think, of intervention. And there are a number of efforts in which this is already underway to minimize the capability of Houthi missile attacks to hit targets. Not easy. Houthis have a degree of capability here that has been difficult to completely neutralize. But we need the support of the Omanis here as well, and we've had some good success in that regard. I think in terms of regional support for stopping the movement of Iranian technology into Houthi lands. But bear in mind how quickly the Houthis have been able to generate this capability. And if you look at the Lebanon theater as an example, it took a long time for Hezbollah to develop this kind of capability. So I think that's one way in which the administration has really come to see the urgency of the Yemen situation. Secondly is the humanitarian piece. The president himself, President Trump, has been moved by the humanitarian realities in Yemen, and he has acted in a number of ways to help, I think, improve, for the coalition to improve access. So his personal intervention has been quite helpful. That's not going to solve all of the problems, but more and more, I think, is the point I was making earlier, that, and this relates to the lady's conflict, a question about the media here, is that exposing what the Iranians are doing in Yemen, I mean, there's a great deal of focus on the coalition. I mean, the drumbeat in the Western media, you're right, is absolutely devastating. All starving children are attributed to the coalition, to Saudi Arabia in particular. I mean, nobody likes to see this, and nobody's efforts that have led to this situation should be excused or condoned, but this is not all on the coalition. And I think you're absolutely right that the Houthis have been able to capitalize on this situation to paint the coalition as the villain in Yemen. So there does need to be more balance. And I think the more that the other side of the story can get out is very important. Because I think at the end of the day, one should not excuse or condone the Iranian element here. If, as others have said here, we can get the Iranians to a point where they're playing a constructive role, then that is all to the better. And believe me, I'm sure the U.S. would respond in some positive way to that. We're very, very keen to see this conflict wind down. We have a pretty vigorous dialogue with international NGOs at the State Department. We meet with them, our Deputy Secretary, on a monthly basis. We hear their reports. We get their input. We hear what their people are saying on the ground. We use that to factor into our own advocacy with the Saudi-led coalition in terms of, humanitarian arteries being kept open, very important element of the picture. But I think the sooner we can pull these various strands together, if the media takes a more balanced, a balanced approach, that's important. Members of our Congress, as you can see, are very focused on civilian casualties. It's a valid issue. But we're doing what we can through our support to the Saudis and the Emiratis to mitigate the potential for civilian casualties. Some positive steps have been made, but clearly a lot more needs to be done in that realm.
Okay, go on.
Hi, I'm Nathan Toronto. I'm on the faculty of the UAE National Defense College. And thank you very much for hosting this and having this. It's a great opportunity to learn more about Reconstruction in Yemen. One question that comes to mind as we think about building a lasting peace is, what do the Houthis want? I'm thinking strategically. Why are they fighting? What do they want to get out of the war? And I think it's important to ask that because, there's a long history of conflict in Yemen, and so it behooves us to understand what their strategic objectives are, so that we know that the peace we establish doesn't sort of undermine those objectives in the future and they go back to fighting, because they could always just go back to fighting, right? So what do they want? What do they want out of negotiations? What do they want out of the conflict? And something else that came to mind, if for the U.S. administration, if the Iranians came to you and said, okay, we'll get out of Yemen. In exchange, you guys get out of Yemen. How would the U.S. administration respond to that?
Okay, and Mr. Abulahoum, if I can turn to you about the question about what do the Houthis want, and
It's very difficult to say exactly what they want, but we should say, what can they get? I think they should get a fair deal, and a fair deal will be something that is accepted by them and by the people. Again, one of the biggest setback is that the legitimate government has not performed well. So you're falling in the trap of supply and demand. They have not filled that demand, whether in the liberated areas or in other areas. And that's what makes the Houthis strong. So if we are to have a peace process, and if you are to have a reconciliation government that will include everybody, that's where the test is. You have to perform well. And the legitimate government has to behave, to change its attitude. And that's what makes, because right now you only have one guy at the block, and that's the Houthis that are in those areas. No competition to them. And it's difficult to say what do they want. Of course, they would not tell you what they want, because they want to go they want to have as much as they can. And that's why we have to be realistic about getting negotiations moving. And I'm sure they understand where the limit is.
Just to add a word to what Mohammed said, I think one of the issues with the Houthis is they're not, and I think Tim mentioned this earlier, they're not really a monolith. In a sense, there is a single voice that speaks for all the Houthis. And this has been an issue all along. The lack of real clear command and control in the organization makes it difficult to know if the interlocutor you're speaking to really has the influence he may claim over the entire movement. And will that be conveyed down the chain of command to the commanders on the ground who are running the checkpoints, who may be the ones to be the ultimate impediment to whatever kind of a political deal is struck at another level. So I think we need to identify leadership as best we can within the movement that does have that ability to influence down through the chain of command and get things done.
We don't have any particular issue with dialogue with the Houthis, by the way, to add to these questions. It's been a couple of years since we had a concerted discussion with them. That goes back to November 2016. John Kerry, then Secretary of State, his meeting with the Houthis in Muscat, and we've maintained inconsistent contacts since then, but we are not opposed to contacts that we feel would be constructive in terms of either identifying more of what the Houthis require or what their demands are, or in building an acceptable place for them into the sort of overall peace accord that we've been talking about. If the Houthis were, or the Iranians were to say, we get out, you get out, I mean, obviously that's something that we'd look at. We're not, in a way, we'd love to be less involved, but we think the urgency of the situation demands it, and our support to the territorial integrity of Saudi Arabia and the UAE demands it, and the humanitarian situation demands it. We don't want to pull back the donor funds that we've given as long as we feel it meets the kind of needs that we collectively are pushing for in Yemen. We want our assistance to be localized, to have impact, to meet the needs of the people. Believe me, if we felt that that assistance weren't effective and we could move it to some other theater, that would be fine. But I think the urgent needs now inside Yemen demand a strong U.S. commitment. Until we see this situation stabilized on a better footing, we plan to stay very much engaged at both the political and the humanitarian level.
So again, if you do have a question, please go to either end of the microphones, and we're going to be taking the questions one by one. I have a gentleman here, and then I'll turn to you. Please go ahead.
Assalamu alaikum. I am Mohammed from Yemen. My question to Mohammed also about the political elite in Yemen. And if you look to the history of Yemen from the 60s, 70s, 80s, it's full of conflict. You talked about reconciliation. My question is, are the war created by our political elite? And can we trust them to rebuild peace? Because they are the one who going to create this new government, whatever. And all the donation, restructuring is going to through them. They put us in the war. How can they put us in peace? And the other question to Tim is about policies, especially in the United States, is keep changing with different administrations. How serious are they committed to Yemen directly to Yemen without changing with the new different administration? It looks like Democrats have their own policy, Republic have their own policies, and we caught up in the middle between a political rivalry in D.C., Washington. Thank you.
Thank you. Please.
It's true about the political elite, but if you look throughout, especially 2011 until today, that map has really changed. And I think what we hope to see in Yemen is a new political map. And if you ask me, I think even the political parties today, again, we go back to the question, how influential are the political parties in Yemen? And they're considered to be elite, or the leadership of these political parties. I think they're weak. They have not done well. And what you see today, I mean, you never hear the voice of any political party during the conflict. They jump in on the peace process. And that's why I think this is a serious issue that has to be done. And when I say there is a transitional period or a period of working out things, this is where the responsibility comes, or moral responsibility of the region and the international community. They have to help us draw up a new map, a map that will reflect on Yemen, Yemeni players in there, and we don't want to keep on repeating. And again, one other thing, that issue that we all are worried about is political Islam. And again, political Islam is a serious issue. I mean, Yemenis have tried political Islam, whether it's the Sunnis in 2011 or the Shiites right now. So I think nobody can say that Yemen needs more political Islam. And that's one of the biggest challenges, that Yemen has to have institutions. We have to build a serious institutions in Yemen, and I'm sure after the war stops, you will see a new political map. You will not continue to, you will not see the political parties. I mean, look at the GPC, the General People's Congress. It's not what it used to be. Look at the Islah, it's not what it used to be. I am optimistic that we will see new coalitions that will come up, new coalitions from different directions. And that's where things will be heading. And I hope that this is where we hope to see Yemen moving in that direction.
With regard to the different administrations, you're absolutely right that it's part of our system. Newly elected officials can come in and redirect policies toward whatever region it may be. But with Yemen and this region, there have been constants, one of which is the territorial integrity of Saudi Arabia. It's been a pillar of U.S. policy in the region for the last 80 years. And secondly, pushing back on Iranian malign influence. We did sign under the Obama administration a nuclear accord, of course, but even so, the Obama administration was very much against Iran's malign influence in the region, its interference in a number of countries in the Arabian Peninsula and Lebanon, its use of proxies, et cetera. So those two have been strong constants of our policy toward the region for decades. Remember that it was in the Obama administration that we launched strikes at Houthi targets inside Yemen, October of 2016. We haven't done that under this administration, but there's a very strong level of engagement with regard to Yemen. And remember that Yemen, of course, is competing with other crises in the world for our attention. It's North Korea, it's Syria, and it's Russia and other problems. But fortunately, and I see a number of career people from either State Department, USAID in this audience. It has been a constant for us as career folks to keep our administration's focus on really urgent political and humanitarian crises. Even if the media is distorting what is going on inside Yemen, from our point of view, it's at least generating interest. Now, part of the interest in the United States is more and more people are saying, what are we, the United States, doing there? Why are we supporting this Saudi-led coalition, et cetera? So there is that piece, but there's also increasing focus, I think, on the humanitarian side. Why are all these people starving, facing cholera outbreaks, et cetera? And we need to use that to generate more support for ending the conflict. Maybe we're at a moment where the various stars are aligning here, where we can really make some progress that allows us to get at some of the challenges that we're going to face here long term. I think, as others have said, we're just at the start of this process. Major challenges ahead. We're going to need the international community to join together and support this effort if we're going to make any lasting change.
Thank you. Please.
My name is Jonathan James. There's one other area in the region where they're trying to build a lasting peace, namely Iraq. Mr. Lenderking, what has the US, and indeed you personally, from your experience in Baghdad, learned about how to put together an international effort to build a lasting peace? And what are the, if you like, the big takeaways which you're bringing to Yemen, having had all this recent experience in Iraq? And the same question, if you like, from slightly different aspect to Mr. Mohammed. Notwithstanding all the divisions within Yemeni society, Yemeni nationalism is nonetheless still a strong force. So from your perspective, what do you want from nations contributing to the rebuilding of Yemen, and what don't you want from nations contributing to the rebuilding of Yemen? In other words, what sensitivity, what nationalist sensitivity is there in Yemen to assistance being provided from the outside?
Thank you.
I would offer 3 points that I think you can apply to different situations, and that certainly draw on my experience working in Afghanistan or Iraq. One is, I think, in order to achieve results, you have to have a sustained commitment. I think that it's easy to be blown off course, lose interest, be pulled into other regional conflicts. you take your eye off the needle. I think the second is you have to have clear objectives. There has to be a clear sense, certainly within the U.S. government, different agencies, but within the international community about what the objectives are. 3, there has to be coordination. So I think if you have, in terms of how the different international actors play in that particular theater, if you don't have those, you're going to run into all kinds of conflicts. I would add a 4th. Of course, I work for the U.S. government, but I do think that U.S. leadership can be beneficial, and that when we are engaged, we can rally resources behind us, political commitment, build coalitions that can be very productive in terms of building a lasting peace.
I think what is needed from the international or the region or everywhere is we would like to see serious partners that can help Yemen move forward. Serious partners in education, long-term policies, in investment, on so many things. Yemenis can be serious partners, and I think what can Yemenis offer is fighting counter-terrorism. I mean, AQAP, Daesh. Yemenis have been serious partners in the past, and they will be serious partners. And that's why you have to put the trust in Yemen and help dismantle all these militias. All these militias, once there is an investment, once there is other option for people to go to, you will see these militias being dismantled. We've seen that through the 60s, the 70s, the 80s, and the 90s. I can assure you, Yemen does not have a die-hard militias. They do not belong to certain cult or groups. Today, if you look at the track record from 70s, 80s, and 90s, they went with the socialists, they went with the Muslim Brother, they went with the Houthis, they went with that. Yemenis are quite sophisticated. They would like to live, and if the stability is in there, you will see them entrepreneurs. We have huge businessmen that are scattered all over the world. They would like to come back to Yemen, and they would like to participate in Yemen. So if we can provide that atmosphere of security and stability, this is the biggest challenge that is facing Yemen, and I think this is where the international, especially our regional powers, can help in moving forward.
But what do you want to avoid from outside partners or supporters?
It's very difficult to say what do you want to avoid. Today, the world is one. You cannot avoid anything. It's up to you what you take and what you leave. It's, I mean, there is no closed doors. I mean, if you open your TV, you see the entire world. I mean, everything is open. I mean, and no country is going to give you something without getting something in return. So how do you balance that? This is something that you have to work, and that's why you need a serious government, a responsible government that can look at the interests of Yemenis and the interests of others. Because after all, we live in a one world that we have to work and face these challenges. And I think the biggest challenges that will come down the road in 4 or 5, 6 years is radicalism. How do you tackle that? I mean, the only way you will tackle radicalism is by education and by seriously working education and investment. Other than that, you will have a long process in that direction.
I would just add one thing I hope that the international community can avoid, especially the regional partners who are deeply invested in Yemen, is using the reconstruction process as a way to pick winners and losers so that they can benefit those parties within Yemen who have allied themselves with their interests, and they can at the same time disadvantage those viewed as adversaries. I think if you try to split Yemen down along those lines, it'll be a very destructive and ultimately destabilizing force. So I think the regional parties have to step back and see the interest of a stable Yemen as very much serving their own larger interests.
Mohammed Saif from Al-Oraibi TV channel. And my question to Mr. Mohammed Abulahoum. It's about did the achievements of government forces, especially in Hodeidah and Saada, now they are close to Marran Mountains. Did these achievements forced Al-Houthi to go for negotiations in Stockholm?
I'm sure if you look at the coalition in the last 3, 4, 5 months, there has been serious advancements. And they did hit hard, whether in the coast or some other parts, but I think on the coast has been real success. And I think this is where the pressure came from. Saada is another, some pressure. But right now, it's important that they sit on the table and they compromise. Whoever is not going to compromise this time in Sweden will be punished by the people, because supporters will not continue to come on and fight and fight and fight, because you reach to a point where you say enough is enough. And I think this is the breaking point. And I think, yes, in Al-Hudaydah played a major role in recalculating the whole thing. Yes.
Thank you.
Go ahead.
Hello, my name is Tyrell, and thank you so much for being here today. I wanted to take the discussion back to that of the challenges of the peace and reconciliation that we have at hand, particularly with everything going on in Sweden at the moment. And we know that for long-lasting peace, at least statistically, one of the most important aspects is that the greater powers have either less of an interest or not conflicting interests. Not to be too blunt, but that is perhaps not the case in Yemen and many parts of the Middle East. So my question is, with the peace negotiations happening now, how can the greater powers reconcile their interests in Yemen? And how will, particularly now with the previous US Department of State President, how do you think the US can reconcile their interests in Yemen? And what are perhaps the interests? And in regard to a Yemenis point of view, how can you go about addressing the bigger powers' interests in the negotiations that are happening in Stockholm as well? Thank you.
I wouldn't overstate conflict among great powers in the Yemen theater at the moment. I think the major problem that we've talked about is Iran. I don't know whether, I'm not calling them a great power, but certainly a regional player of importance. But we have very strong coordination with the Russians on Yemen in various mechanisms. There is a good deal of convergence between us and the Russians on Yemen. Chinese, maybe less of a dialogue with the Chinese, but we don't see, for the most part, strong variant agenda by the Chinese in Yemen that really conflicts or undermines what we are all talking about here. I think with Saudi Arabia and the UAE, I've talked about the coordination mechanisms that we use, very constant dialogue, not only in meetings at various levels, phone calls by Secretary of the President, Secretary Mattis, et cetera. There's a very strong level of engagement with ensuring that a couple of players are on the same page. The UK has played a very positive role here with its historical experience in Yemen and also helping us to coordinate assistance. The UN Security Council, I think, can play a strong role going forward. Perhaps after the talks in Sweden, there'll be a good opportunity for the Security Council to affirm or amplify what has come out, what we hope comes out of the Sweden talk. So I feel more sanguine about the Yemen theater than I might about Syria or other regional conflicts where there is more competition between the regional powers.
Thank you. This is really a follow-up question for Mr. Mohammed, but I welcome the response from Das Lenderking and the ambassador as well. Let's suppose that...
Sorry, could you identify
Oh,
yourself?
yeah, sorry. Trevor Johnston, Rand Corporation. So if we suppose that Martin's efforts in Stockholm build momentum and are successful, and we begin some kind of transitional period with a caretaker government, and that we aren't overly impatient and we allow for the process to take hold and we don't rush elections, even if we follow that kind of conditions-based phasing approach 2-3 years from now, unless conditions dramatically change, it seems to be the case that the Houthis or Islah would be best positioned in those first set of elections. And so I'm just wondering, what are specific institutional structures that would actually allow for some kind of Republican checks and constraints to ensure that the first set of elections aren't the last ones? Because I'm also hopeful that there will be a new coalitional realignment, because the party system has been broken in a lot of ways, but I don't see any clear reason to believe that that would be the case and that you wouldn't have a Houthi-dominated government or an Islahi-dominated government. So, thank you.
Thank you. So this will be our last question because we'll be wrapping up the panel shortly. So we'll take this question, then we'll come to closing remarks. Please.
Yeah, this is a good question. I can assure you, if you look at the political parties from 2011 until today, they are not in a strong position. The sounds of guns does not mean they have that strength. When the guns are silent, you will see a new dynamics in there. Don't forget that you have a big independents in there, moderates in there. I'm sure they will play a much bigger role because what we have seen from especially the Houthis and the Islah or the religious groups, I don't think they have performed well, whereby people will say, yes, we will hold on to them. People would like to see change. And don't be surprised. I mean, if you look, I mean, with no comparison, if you look at new elections that are happening, whether in France or any other areas, people came out of, not from the original, I mean, the usual institutions. People want change. How do you encourage that change? This is where the responsibility happens to be from the region. How do you support? Like the ambassador said, don't go to the old clients, old customers that you keep on helping. Look at the other independents. Give yourself a 2-3 year where you level the ground for everybody so that you will create certain coalitions. I can assure you there is discussion right now about talking about coalitions, already starting to talk about. So hopefully if we are to see a transitional period, probably hopefully we meet again in 3-4 years, we'll see that there is a serious change. And I think the GPC will play a big role, not being as a GPC. You will see a breakup probably of a GPC. You will see GPC going in different directions. And you see a lot of independent finding other political coalitions. I don't think that they're going to go for the Houthis or for the Islah. So this is something that is different about Yemen, and we hope that it will happen.
Yeah, I would certainly agree. It seems to me that coming out of this conflict, the parties who have been really involved in it deeply are going to be very discredited. And it's going to be hard for them to regain the confidence of the broad swath of the population in an election when the recollections will still be there of exactly how long they mangled the country in their own interests. So I cannot imagine at the moment a scenario in which the Houthis have a lot of electoral resonance among Yemenis. And I do think Mohammed's point about a new landscape emerging is one that seems to me to be the most likely way forward. And I think it's going to be kind of hybrids of certain parties now. It's going to reemerge, joining forces with others that perhaps will be non-traditional kind of alliances that I think will speak to regional, geographical, and other requirements that are going to be emerging. So I'm fairly optimistic that the landscape, and again, the point is, don't rush into elections. I don't think Yemenis are going to insist on going to the polls 6 months, 1 year, 18 months after a conflict. They're going to want to see stability, economic opportunity, and a sense of a future forming. That's not necessarily, to me, a scenario that requires going and having elections early.
So if you're not going to have elections, is it a matter of building those grand coalitions where you try to do the power sharing? I mean, who decides what the transitional government looks like?
Well, I think if we imagine there's going to be a national unity government of some sort that emerges, it's going to speak to a lot of the different parties. They will, over time, then begin to plot out a landscape that will see elections in the future. So coalitions will begin to form as electoral possibilities and options emerge on the horizon, and they get to see where their strengths lie regionally and elsewhere, where they need to be. So I think it's kind of an organic, natural process that will emerge as stabilization itself emerges within Yemen.
What would a transitional government look like? It's not based on how strong you are. This is a transitional period that has to take everybody in. From the south, from the north, from all groups have to participate in there. And you give yourself enough space. And just to go back to the question, what if the Islah and the Houthis? I think the Islah and Houthis enjoyed a lot of support in the last 5 years, 10 years from the region. I think this support will stop. It has to go somewhere else. It has to go more into institutions. It has to go more into civil society. It has to go more to women and others. And that's why I think the outcome or the new phase of Yemen will not be dominated by those traditional political parties. And I do sense that. I mean, you can tell, especially when you sit with people that they're not in the same mood they used to be 5 years or 10 years ago. They're looking for something new.
Okay, as we come to a close of this panel, I want you each to give us some thoughts about how do we protect this very fragile, cautious optimism that we're sensing? Because it is very fragile, it's very early days, but there is a sense of optimism that we haven't felt for some time. So what do the people who are attending here today and others need to do to protect that fragile optimism and actually maintain that momentum?
I think, first of all, we need to approach the situation with a sense of urgency. This isn't, you know, an academic exercise that we're talking about in terms of stabilization and, you know, thwarting famine-level conditions, et cetera. It's real and it's happening. I think, you know, from our point of view, you can expect continued strong support for Martin Griffiths' efforts. We will rally to the best of our ability. The institutions, other countries to support this effort. I think we're in it for the long haul. I know that there are going to be, you know, a great deal of turbulence coming down the road, I'm sure, but we need to be patient, keep our eye on, I think, ultimate goals of stabilization. I think for us also, listening to the Yemeni voices, getting to a point where they can be amplified more and you know, the outside influence can respond accordingly. I do agree to the notions that have been talked about here that there is capacity and capability that just needs to be tapped in a way so that Yemenis can take charge of this situation. I think it's very important for Martin's efforts to have tangible results soon. It gets to the question of how do we see and build in incentives. How do the Yemen people see that this isn't just a far-off gathering of outside actors? And so those tangible results, let's get the airport open, let's get some prisoners exchanged, get the central bank stabilized, work to stabilize the Yemeni rial. I think the more we can inject in a fast track without overwhelming the system, these kind of tangible results, we will be able to build from there.
I do agree with what Mr. Lenderking said. The coming phase or stage, let's take whatever comes out of Sweden. Let's not raise the bar too high and then be disappointed. Just take what we have and move forward. And I do hope that the international community will be more observant of what is happening. We would like to see a stick and a carrot to to the players. And people in there do listen to the international community. They listen to the P5. And the P5 has to come out with certain resolutions that will punish whoever is a spoiler. And whoever is a spoiler would hate to be on that list. And they do understand. And that's why they are in Sweden. So if we keep that momentum going, and once the wheel starts moving, and I think it will hopefully start moving in Sweden, how fast or how slow is good. And then we can always build on it. And that's how we hope to see things moving.
To which I can only say amen. Baby steps, let's get it done, you know, it's quickly, but at the same time, respectfully and slowly as we need to. Don't let our impatience get in the way of our success. There is a moment here that we can really build upon. I think people are really looking to channel energy and ambition into this moment. So I think we need to stay as close as we can to Martin Griffiths, support his efforts, make sure that there's no daylight between what he's doing and what the great powers in the world are thinking about at the same time.
So that was session number 1 to get you thinking for the rest of the day, a lasting piece. What we've heard from our excellent panelists is the need for sustained, continued efforts, the need to help people's lives get better, because at the end of the day, that's what this is all really about, and to help the livelihoods of Yemenis in the process. We have a small break now. At 11:30, the next panel will meet. Please thank our great speakers.